Such good energy in this room. I am Joan Harrington. I'm the assistant director for, yay! Yay! Good audience. Assistant director for social sector ethics here at the Markkula Center. And on behalf of the Markkula Center and the social sector ethics team, Ann Skeet, Sarah Tangdahl, and Kirk Hansen, the executive director of Markkula, we welcome you to this event. I have been informed I need to tell you that we are being videotaped and audio taped, so anything you say will be there for posterity, something to keep in mind. We are very pleased that you chose to attend this event. I think it's interesting that there is such good attendance. I think it speaks to our shared interest and concern about the great wealth in Silicon Valley that is not always making its way to the great need in Silicon Valley. Our speaker today is Heather McLeod Grant from Open Impact, and she is the co-author of The Giving Journey, The Giving Code, and the most recent Open Impact report, which is called The New Normal. And that looks at the disruptive effects of the most recent political environment and the economic environment and the impact on nonprofits and funders. So we're hoping that you'll be back to talk about that. Of her many accomplishments, I want to say I think the most significant one is being Kirk Hansen's student at Stanford Business School. So full circle here. She is co-author of the book Forces for Good, The 6 Practices of High-Impact Nonprofits, and helped lead the nonprofit practice at Monitor Institute. She's been a venture partner with Draper Richards Kaplan and has served on numerous local, national, and global boards. Please welcome Heather McLeod Grant.
Thanks, Joan. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm excited to be here today. I can't imagine a more important mission than the mission of the Markkula Center in the day and age that we live in. Everywhere I look, you see conversations about ethics, right? Whether it's United States government, the White House, media, our local community foundation, it's everywhere. So, and I just want to say thank you to Kirk and to the Markkula Center team for having me here. I was indeed Kirk's student, took tons of notes, learned so much. And, I just think it's so important to have ethics integrated into business schools and into the fabric of our society. I think, my undergraduate major was in political philosophy and social studies. So I had studied some of the great ethical thinkers as an undergrad, and then I went to business school because I'm like, okay, that's all well and good, but now I need to understand how to raise money and, read a balance sheet and run a nonprofit organization. And, I was always astonished that, I have been astonished that business schools haven't taken ethics more seriously. I think it's so critical and so important, especially because, look at the whole conversation about Facebook, right? I'm sure you've been having that conversation here and what some of these tech companies are doing to our democracy. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to start out by just giving a few remarks about just a 10-minute short summary of the Giving Code, because the Giving Journey really picks up where the Giving Code left off. How many of you were here at my business partner Alexa's presentation about a year ago? Okay, so a handful of you. Like I said, I am going to start there because I do think it's important context for the conversation about new donors. The Giving Code is really a macro look at what's happening in aggregate with philanthropy in Silicon Valley, both the supply and the demand side. The Giving Journey is really a deep dive into a more qualitative look at how do we understand these donors. So raise your hand if you are here representing a foundation or a philanthropic organization that's doing grant making. Okay, so we've got... Yeah, okay. Raise your hand if you're working for a nonprofit that's trying to raise money. Okay, yeah, okay. So we've got, I figured there was a reason why you came to this presentation, right? So just by way of background, I have lived in Silicon Valley for 20 years now, since I went to Stanford Business School. Wow, okay, we're in the dark. Let's see, we'll get the, yeah, all right. And you know what, while we're doing some tech setup, can I just move this a tiny bit back so I'm not blocking my slides? There we go. I know you probably want it in the video, so. Okay, perfect.
The entire rest of the presentation.
I know, right. I'll just stand here and I'll keep saying Markkula Center and ethics. So Alexa and I both live here, we work here, we volunteer, and we give here. Alexa's background is in philanthropy. I'll just keep talking while we have this light show going on.
Right there.
Awesome. So Alexa spent 20 years in philanthropy working with high net worth donors, helping set up and run their foundation. So she knows a lot about how to give away capital. She worked for Chuck Schwab, and then she worked for the Stupsky Foundation, and then about 5 years ago started her own consulting firm. My background is I was a social entrepreneur. So I started out in the trenches running a nonprofit organization, raising money, and literally paying myself $14,000 a year in the mid-90s. So believe me, when I went to business school, I had everybody beat in terms of upping my income afterwards. And then I worked in consulting firms, McKinsey and Monitor. And then a couple years ago, Alexa and I combined forces and started Open Impact because we really wanted to start talking about how do we bring this the capital side together with the people and the ideas that are really changing the world, right? So we decided to do this research because living here, you know, we had clients who were giving away money. We had clients who were nonprofits. We really saw a lot of the community-based organizations in our own backyard struggling to raise money. And, you know, we would be out and about talking to other folks around the country, and they'd say, oh, we're going to open an office in Silicon Valley because that's where all the money is. And it's like it's falling off the trees out there. And I would have to say to them, well, hang on, because even the nonprofits who are already in Silicon Valley and already have the best shot at accessing this money are having a hard time. So why is that? We wanted to really understand what was going on with the market here. So Packard Foundation graciously funded us to do some pretty rigorous research. And as you guys may know, none of this data is out there anywhere in aggregate. We actually had to call on a lot of our personal relationships in the community to get data from a number of organizations. But really, we tried to look at the supply side, how much wealth is being created, how much of that money is going to philanthropy, and then most importantly, where is it going, and what is it that the nonprofits need? So again, taking a holistic look at this marketplace. And, you know, I'm going to give you the quick headlines, and then we'll get more into the mindset of these new donors. But it's not a surprise if you live here that we've been in an unprecedented decade of economic growth. So the last 10 years since the Great Recession, which, by the way, didn't impact the Bay Area as much as it hit financial markets on the East Coast, we've had phenomenal growth in these companies, right? Facebook, Apple, Google, where my husband now works, $833 billion in sales coming out of corporations headquartered in Silicon Valley. You probably saw the news lately that California's economy, if ranked as a nation, is now 5th largest. We just surpassed the UK. And we have 76,000 millionaires and billionaires. And this, by the way, this data is specific to Santa Clara and San Mateo counties. So literally where, you know, those of us in this room live. We did not look at Marin, we didn't look at East Bay, we didn't even look at San Francisco, partly because of the Packard Foundation, partly because it's so complicated to get this data. It was going to be even more hard to do that over a 9-county region. So we really just looked at 2 counties. But you can imagine these trends are playing out in other counties in the Bay Area as well. 21 unicorn companies, et cetera. So how much of that enormous wealth creation, this new Gilded Age, how much of this money is going to philanthropy? Well, the good news is it turns out quite a bit of it is being set aside and earmarked for philanthropy. I'm not going to take you through all the data slides. I'm going to show you just a few snippets, but individual giving in Silicon Valley, and this is the most recent data we had when we did our research in 2015, $5 billion. In aggregate, individual giving that comes out of this region. Private foundations with more than $10 million in assets have doubled in the last decade. So that's new foundations being set up by newly wealthy families. Typically, you don't set up a foundation unless you have at least 40, 50, $100 million to give. Donor advised funds, 300% growth in Schwab and Fidelity. This does not include the Silicon Valley Community Foundation data because they didn't want to share it with us, but Schwab and Fidelity did. And they've had 300% growth in the number of donor advised funds set up, 900% growth in assets in those funds, right? And this morning on NPR, how many of you heard driving in today, there was a whole segment, Mina Kim was interviewing the author of the Atlantic magazine, just did a piece on the Community Foundation. And they were talking about giving in Silicon Valley, and they quoted some of our data from the Giving Code. Corporate giving has doubled. And what I will say about that, however, is that corporate giving in aggregate, it's a little over 100 million a year from all these corporations. So it is actually not as significant a piece of the giving pie, if you will. A lot of corporate involvement has to do with pro bono, right? Employee engagement, employee matching grants, which is not counted in this number. This is just direct grants from corporate foundations. and cause marketing. So underwriting events and even giving away product for free. You know, Salesforce gives away a lot of their product. Google, Facebook will give free ads, et cetera, to nonprofits. So corporate giving, even though the corporations are huge and have enormous wealth and assets, they're not actually the biggest players in the philanthropic scene. So I just like to say that to put these things in context. The biggest piece of the pie is individual giving. And we're going to talk a lot more about that. So donor advised funds, this is just one snapshot, but you can see this kind of hockey stick, right? And you know, what's interesting is that we did this report, it came out 2 years ago, well, a year and a half ago in the fall of 2016, and it's actually got national media coverage because there are people now around the country who are sort of looking at Silicon Valley and saying, wow, what's happening here is going to shape and disrupt what philanthropy looks like nationally and even globally. And I think that's true. So we're really sitting at the epicenter of this new kind of Gilded Age. So again, those of you familiar with the report, when we looked at where is the money going, this is sort of the bad news side of the story. A lot of this money is going to national and global causes. These companies are global. Their principals live and work globally. Many of them have houses in other parts of the country and the world, Hawaii, Aspen, London, New York. They tend to think of their philanthropy very globally. And as a result, and by the way, a lot of it is sitting in donor advised funds until they figure out what they want to do with that. And I'm going to talk more about DAFs in just a minute. But very little of it is actually making its way to local community-based organizations. And of about the 10% of giving that does go locally to nonprofits, much of it, I want to just, sorry, I think there was, here it is. I'm going to just skip ahead to this chart and I'll come back to those others. Much of it is actually going to hospitals and institutes of higher education. So love Santa Clara University, love Stanford, love the development team who's in the room. It's all good and it's a both and, right? We can't just take the easy way out and say, well, you know, Stanford, my alma mater, has 600 development people. They can produce the best marketing materials. Many of the wealthy folks in this region are alums of the university or have had kids go to the university. They already have a relationship. So in many ways, they have an unfair competitive advantage when they're up against people running grassroots community-based organizations. They have the resources to put into marketing and reaching these donors. So let's just talk briefly about what's going on in Silicon Valley. You guys also know this story because my guess is many of you are on the front lines serving these populations. You know, 1 in 3 residents is relying on assistance. Middle class is declining. You know, we're seeing this, you know, just the conversation about housing alone in the last 2 years has shifted dramatically because what's happening is as we have all this economic growth, it's creating jobs. That's great for employment. But if you're not qualified to get some of those jobs, if you don't have the right education from the right university, 70% of tech workers are foreign born. There are a lot of people who can no longer afford to live and work in our communities because it's driving the price of real estate up. And as a result, we're seeing nonprofits really getting slammed. And my guess is, you know, a lot of you in this room are feeling the pinch, right? Demand is up across the board. And by the way, this data in our new normal report is now national because government is cutting back on social services and social spending. Nonprofits are having to fill in the gap. So they're seeing demand for their services go up, partly because of income inequality and people being displaced. Partly because the cost of living is so high here that many families are having to choose between paying the rent and putting food on the table. So they're actually turning to the food bank. We've heard of school teachers and nurses and firefighters having to access social services. It's unprecedented. Costs are rising. You know, average salary at Facebook, did you guys hear this stat? I think it's $250,000. I mean, that's absurd, right? Most executive directors of nonprofits don't make that, right? And that's for the top leadership role. So you're having to compete for talent, pay wages, and pay rent. Thank God for the Sobrato centers, you know, and for folks who are subsidizing nonprofit rent. As a result, many nonprofits are really struggling. So that's all the backdrop. Let's talk about what's happening in philanthropy. And I want to dig a little bit deeper. So first of all, the landscape is changing. So what we're seeing with this new generation of wealthy givers, yes, and you guys all have the handouts so you can follow along and take notes. First of all, family offices and wealth advisors are becoming the new gatekeepers. So these families, especially because we're seeing so much income disparity where it's the top 9% now own 50% of the wealth in the United States, I think that's the accurate stat. They surround themselves with gatekeepers, and the money managers are sort of the first in the door, right? Because when you have an IPO or an exit, you're suddenly like, oh my gosh, my net worth just went from $1 million to $100 million overnight. What do I do with all this? I need a good money manager. I need somebody to help me with my taxes. I need somebody to run my investments. By the way, I just bought a yacht. Somebody needs to manage my boat. So you have these new gatekeepers who really come out of the world of finance and investing and don't actually understand the world of the social sector as much. You're also seeing hybrid structures being set up. This new generation of donors, Chan Zuckerberg is a great example, Emerson Collective is another. They're setting up LLCs because they want to do impact investing. They want to have multiple options for how they think about impact. And I actually think that's not entirely a bad thing. I think it gives them more flexibility. But the net result is people aren't just setting up foundations as much and hanging out a shingle and saying, here's what I care about, nonprofits come to me and seek grants, right? It's much less transparent. Right? And there are many more levels of gatekeeping. And then donor advised funds, where there currently is no forced payout. Now, some DAFs, Schwab and Fidelity, showed data. Fidelity just published data saying that actually their average donor gives out at about a 20% rate. I haven't dug into that. Forced payout for foundations is 5% by IRS rules. So I want to know a little more about that data. My hunch is that's their kind of average everyday giver. The thing we're seeing is people putting literally like $1 billion into a donor advised fund and just parking it because they don't know what to give it to yet, right? So the really big money is tending to sit there. They're not giving out at 20% payout rates. And there's some barriers to connection with these donors. Again, you're probably experiencing a lot of this, knowledge and information gaps. Many of these new donors come out of tech and come out of business, and so they don't actually have a moral language for even thinking about what we do in the social sector. There's network and experience gap. We had our first house in Redwood City. We now live in Woodside. It is an incredibly affluent community. And, I can see every day how if you live in a place like Woodside or Atherton or Menlo Park, you can get in your car and drive to your Facebook campus and do work and go home and never see the poverty that exists in East Palo Alto or East San Jose or parts of Redwood City. I mean, it is literally all around us and invisible at the same time. And a lot of these families send their kids to private schools. They're not in the public school district. There's literally no intersection between the social networks of the ultra wealthy and then, the folks who really need help. Mindset and language gap. Donors speak the language of business, and ultimately an empathy gap. So again, we wrote about this a lot in the Giving Code. And I want to dig in a little bit more into the mindset of these donors. So based on that report, the Gates Foundation called us up. Their philanthropic partnerships team, they're the ones who work with the Giving Pledge, which, by the way, is, I think, the single biggest innovation in philanthropy. I think what they're doing is amazing because it's all about peer pressure. I mean, the very fact that Bill Gates and Melinda Gates said, we're going to pressure our colleagues to give away most of their wealth in their lifetime. I mean, guys, that's huge. We're looking at something like a $60 trillion transfer of wealth over the next 2 or 3 decades. And as you see, many of these 1%ers who are, many of these billionaires have more money than they could possibly spend in their lifetimes. So Gates called us up and said, we're working with all these donors, and we really want to, not only get them to pledge to give away, but we actually want to help them become more effective. And yet we're seeing a lot of them get really stuck. Why is that? So they asked us to go out and talk to some of these families and these donors and really kind of dig into the psychology and mindset of what does the donor's journey look like. So that's the giving journey research. And it really, again, it sort of picks up where the Giving Code left off and actually really tries to get inside the heads of the experience of these donors. And I want to just emphasize that I think using empathy here is really important, because for you to be successful in fundraising and unlocking some of this capital, you really have to understand where these donors are coming from. That's the first place to start. And by the way, when I talk to rooms full of donors, I tell them they need to have empathy for what nonprofits are going through too. So what we discovered this kind of 5-stage path, and I'm going to go through some of the mindsets of these donors in more detail, but let me just talk about this path briefly. It really starts with the formative experiences from early childhood in terms of shaping what it is donors care about, right? When we actually went out and started to talk to these donors about why do you give, we started with a why question. Why do you give? They're like, almost every single one of them to a T was, well, my parents raised me this way. Or when I was a kid, I would see my mom going to marches. And, or my my parent was volunteering in the community and I've always felt that was a good thing to do, or my faith background, right? So it really is grounded in values. I think the interesting thing that we found, and we wrote about this a little bit in the Giving Code, but we dig into it more in the Giving Journey, is this wealth event and pause. Many of these donors who are becoming extremely wealthy in their 30s and 40s don't just start out giving right away. I mean, yes, there is a trend to giving while living, and yes, they are starting their philanthropy younger. They're not just waiting until they're dead and passing it on to heirs or putting it into an estate. However, it's usually a good 5 to 10 year lag time between when they have an IPO and when they actually start to get unstuck and start to realize the potential of their philanthropy. There's a lot of reasons for that. They're very busy running companies. Many of them are still working full time, even though they've had an exit and they may be billionaires. I mean, look at Larry Page and Sergey Brin. My husband just recently started working at Google. They both come into the office every day. They could both retire. Sheryl Sandberg, they could all retire and just say, I'm done. But that's not fun. They want to stay involved. They want to run these companies. They get a lot of positive feedback from it. They have children. They have young families. They're suddenly confronted with a whole lot of interesting psychological questions about, gee, how much money do I really need to live on for the next 40 or 50 or 60 years, right? How much do I want to leave to my heirs and my children? That takes a long time to unpack and figure out. So then they usually start ramping up, and they usually start ramping up, honestly, by giving to what is familiar. So that means typically they start by giving to the private school where their child's in school, or the public school foundation. Woodside School Foundation raises $2 million a year. It's ridiculous. There's only 400 kids, right? And then I see signs at Redwood City, Sequoia High School, help us reach our goal of 425,000. They probably have 4,000 kids there. I don't know the exact data, but it's, again, this is very unequally distributed. They start by giving to the hospital where their parent was treated, right? Or maybe they have a child who has an illness or has special needs and they're going to give to that cause. So they start with what's familiar. I actually say that's a good thing because at least starts to get them unstuck. So start within your comfort zone. And then over time, what we see is the truly actualized and strategic philanthropists are the ones who start to move out beyond what's comfortable into what's more uncomfortable. Maybe I should look at homelessness in our community. I'm stepping over these people on the street in Palo Alto or in downtown San Francisco. Maybe I have a moral responsibility to do something about that, right? They start looking at the things like structural racism and equity and justice. Not all philanthropists get there. Some of them are just going to give it all to Stanford. But many of them do start to have this journey where they start to learn about social issues and they start to learn about the world that we live in and understand what their money can do. So I want to talk about 5 mindsets, and then I'm going to leave a good 20, 25 minutes for Q&A. So be thinking about questions. So these are the mindsets that we called out in the Giving Code and which were reinforced in the Giving Journey report. And I'm going to just talk about each one briefly and then the implications for you in terms of thinking about how you reach these donors. So I already mentioned the personal and values connection. Many of these donors, their giving is deeply shaped by what they care about, what they're passionate about. I know you already know that, but it is, in some ways, I haven't quite wrapped my head around this yet, but I want to write a piece about, I want to talk to some behavioral economists because honestly, this marketplace is irrational. It's not rational in the same way that if you're a venture capitalist or you're an investor on Wall Street and you have money, you want a profit and you go out and invest it in companies that are seeking to make a profit and you have aligned interest. This is much more like dating. It's about, gee, what do you care about? Oh, you care about saving the koalas. Well, that's not what I'm doing. Sorry, we're not a match, right? So it's like there's this interesting process of almost like dating when you meet donors. You have to figure out what they care about and what they, what stage of their journey they're on. Are they in the comfort zone stage? How are you going to start to get them outside of that comfort zone? And how are you going to do that with little baby steps, right? Almost all of the donors that we talk to are highly social and they're most influenced by their peers. So again, this is why I think that the Giving Pledge is such a brilliant innovation because a lot of this is about peer pressure. Who do they turn to first? When we asked them, how did you figure out your philanthropy? They're like, most of them said, well, my wealth manager wasn't actually very helpful. Like they can understand how I can get, a 10% return in the markets every year in my portfolio, but they don't really know what I should give my money to. And again, many financial managers are not trained in philanthropy. these folks turn to their peers. They're like, I called up my friend who'd set up a foundation 5 years ago, or I joined SV2, the local social venture Silicon Valley, the local giving circle. I reached out to other people I knew who were further down the path than I was. They're also very interested in going to, I'm now, because of the work we're now doing around philanthropy in Silicon Valley, I'm now on all these lists and getting invited to lunches and dinners and fundraisers. And they go where their friends go, right? So if their friend is hosting a dinner, for I don't know what cause, take your pick, Human Rights Watch, for example, I got invited to something by them recently, then they're going to go where their friends are, right? And I think there are a couple examples of organizations who figured out how to crack this in Silicon Valley. I like to talk about the Boys and Girls Club. I don't know if you guys are familiar with them in East Palo Alto. So I know there's Boys and Girls Clubs in different parts of the peninsula. But about 6 or 7 years ago, I sat down with the executive director, Peter Fortenbaugh. He's like, I really need to redo my board. Most of my board is over 60. They're sort of the old guard. They're not the new money coming up, and they're not necessarily as strategic or plugged into the tech sector. And he really went on this mission to upgrade his board, to improve his strategy. So the Boys and Girls Club is now about embedding in schools and closing the achievement gap. So they have an impact-first mission. They're not just like a place to hang out after school and play basketball or ping pong. They're all about closing the achievement gap. They've now partnered up with major tech companies to do internships, LinkedIn, Facebook, Google. And they've gotten some pretty incredible heavy hitters on their board. So they just started doing an annual gala fundraiser. The last fundraiser I went to, he had Susan Wojcicki, the CEO of YouTube, and her sister Ann Wojcicki, founder of 23andMe, right, used to be married to Sergey Brin. They opened. They had Kevin Durant from the Warriors there. They had the CEO of LinkedIn. I mean, it was like a who's who of Silicon Valley. And this is a community-based grassroots organization serving low-income kids in a low-income neighborhood. And I was like, go Peter. But he'd figured it out. Now it helps that he went to Harvard Business School. He's an investor. His kids are in private schools. He knows how to speak the language and he knows how to penetrate those social networks. But I use that as an example because I think this social piece is really important. It's like if you can get one or two of these folks and then get them to bring their friends, that's the key to unlocking some of the giving. They're also very focused on impact, right? So it goes without saying, but this generation, the same way that they think about their tech companies, the next thing I'm going to talk about is innovation and disruption. So innovation, disruption, and impact sort of go hand in hand, but they're really looking for what are you going to achieve? Like it's good to have, I always say it's a little bit of head, a little bit of heart when you're doing good fundraising, right? You want to have the heartwarming, compelling stories, and I think personal stories are always amazing. Like they actually have kids stand up at the Youth of the Year Awards at Boys and Girls Club and tell their story about, you hear these kids and it's like, oh my gosh, this kid was homeless, his sibling was shot, he's got a 4.2, and now he's going off to Yale. That is unbelievable. Like, how did he do that, right? But they also want data and metrics. And I know this is a catch-22 for nonprofits because I know that funders aren't paying you to develop the evaluation systems you need to do the reporting that they want. So it's this weird chicken and egg cycle. And trust me, Alexa and I are out there every day telling funders, if you want good evaluation data, you have to pay for it and you have to invest in building these nonprofits' capacity to do it. But they do want metrics and they do want to know what's the impact you're having, not just heartwarming anecdotes. They also love disruption and innovation because that is the DNA of Silicon Valley, right? This is the footprint that has brought us the Googles and Facebooks of the world. They want to hear how, they're obsessed with scale. And, I think there's pros and cons to that whole debate on scale. What I say to local nonprofits is you don't necessarily have to have aspirations to be national or global. I think Somos Mayfair, right here in East San Jose, Camille Fontanella is a great example of a local nonprofit that is having very deep impact in one community. And she has also figured out, she just gave a presentation at SV2 the other night. They were an SV2 grantee, and for a grassroots social justice community organization, she has figured out how to get in front of these donors and speak their language and raise money from them to invest in the work that she's doing with the disenfranchised, right here in East San Jose. So emphasize your differentiation. Start with small bets. Many of these donors like to start with small gifts. Even folks who have, unfathomable amounts of wealth, 100 million, $1 billion, they often start by giving $10,000 and $20,000 grants. And you're sort of sitting here thinking, but you're a billionaire. You could you could write a $2 million check. They don't start there because it's about trust. They want to build a relationship with you. They want to know that their money is making a difference. The reward is psychic in terms of the feel-good effect they get for knowing that they're having an impact indirectly through your organization on something that they care about. So you have to start small and cultivate over time, right? Again, all the good fundraising books will tell you this. Lastly, these donors approach their philanthropy as they approach their investment portfolios, which is to say they think of it as a portfolio. It's typically not a single issue, a single organization, a single cause, especially when you're talking about the really, really big donors. They're going to have global investments. They may be investing in Africa because they are influenced by effective altruism and think, wow, I can get more bang for my buck by buying bed nets in Africa. I can save thousands of lives when I can only save a couple hundred lives here in the US because the costs are so much higher. And what I argue to local organizations is you have to make the case for being part of that portfolio, right? So if you're investing in global, that's great. If you're investing in Stanford, that's great. There's a place for us in your portfolio. The same way you're going to be diversified as a for-profit investor, and you're going to have emerging markets, and you're going to have some high-risk things, you're going to have some real estate, you're going to have other assets, Fortune 500 tracking stocks, T-bills, et cetera. Think of your philanthropy the same way. There is a place for local in your portfolio, right? These are people who live here, and there's a lot of arguments you can make about why to give locally, but first and foremost is what kind of community do you want your children growing up in? What kind of community do you want to live in? Not to mention the ethical argument, like it's the right thing to do. And then there's the economic argument of, well, your companies are kind of creating all the externalities that the rest of us are having to deal with, so maybe you have an obligation to give back. So use guilt, use, cajoling, whatever works. I've talked a lot about this. These are just some kind of takeaway thoughts. I want to just, in the interest of time, just spend a couple of minutes on this, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. We have a whole session that Alexa and I developed and did at Stanford Social Innovation Review, and it's an hour-long workshop, so I'm not going to do that with you today, but I wanted to give you the cheat sheet. We developed what we consider to be the 10 core elements of an effective pitch deck, right? This is what used to be called a business plan, but none of these executives read documents that are longer than a page or two anymore, and everybody wants everything in PowerPoint. So this is basically what do you need to construct the right kind of strategy and business plan in order to be able to get some of this philanthropic investment in your organization. It always starts with the mission, right? Why do you exist? What's your sort of big, hairy, audacious goal? What is the problem you're trying to solve? Explain the problem you're addressing. Explain why you have a good solution, right? And if it is truly providing short-term services, then you need to make the argument for, yes, we're thinking about systems change. We're partnering with others who are working on systems change. But right now, until we change our systems, these people are going to be homeless if we don't exist, right? Or they need to be able to put food on their tables while we work on fixing income inequality. Talk about your solution and your intervention. Talk about your impact and how you measure it. How do you know that you're succeeding? You may want to talk about your key strategies. Alexa and I, we do a lot of strategy work and strategy consulting, so that's sort of our bias. But I always say that, we don't actually do fundraising work. We don't go out and do grant writing. We don't, we work with donors sometimes on strategies to give away their money, or we'll help with nonprofits on strategies for thinking about how they do what they do and how they can be more effective. But I actually think your fundraising is only as good as your strategy. And any good development officer will tell you, what am I selling? If you can't articulate everything that's up here in terms of who you are, what you do, why you exist, how you're having impact, and how you measure it and know, then you're not going to be able to raise money in this environment. That's just the reality. These donors want to hear about your business model. They're business people. They think in terms of cost per unit, right? What is your cost per individual served, right? How do you think about your revenue strategy over time? What does that pie chart look like in terms of how are you thinking about diversifying it, or how are you thinking about doubling down on those sources that you know are really good for you? Differentiators, what makes you unique? If you're doing like a capital campaign or you're doing a growth plan, you're going to want to have milestones. Like, we're going to come back to you every year and tell you how we're doing. One of the really interesting innovations we've seen is some nonprofits are now starting to do investor calls the same way that for-profit companies have investor calls. So New Door Ventures in San Francisco, which serves low-income youth and does workforce development for kids who have been either homeless or incarcerated or had substance abuse problems, literally some of the hardest to serve kids, and they get them back on track and get them to get GEDs and get back in the workforce. Alexa's been on their board for 20 years. They do investor calls now. I think it's a great idea, right? Again, it's about translating the work that we do into the language of business and capital so that these investors, these philanthropists can understand what it is they're investing in. And then more background information and the ask.
So it's really good news and a little bit of bad news. We have a lot of things we can do. It's just we have to get together and do them because there are opportunities for us to move forward. I would ask you to fill out the evaluation form for the program. This gives us good information on how we can serve the community better. And I would also encourage you to go on our website. You'll see upcoming events and you'll learn about Standards for Excellence training, which I mentioned, and our Partners in Learning community. I think in order for us to follow the rule of the law, you must opt in for us to send you newsletters and emails, and that's an opportunity you have on the eval. Okay? Thank you so much.